Welcome back. We were, thank you, Ruth, our tech woman at the wheel here, Ruth Johnson, for posting our break time notice. We are indeed back now. Mauricio, I'm so glad to have you here. This is our chance to spread our wings and cross continents. COVID-19 may hasten many things, including international collaborations. And we have some terrific writers with us who have experience writing on shows that cross continents and cultures. I'm going to introduce the panel, and then I'm going to let my colleague and associate and fellow professor at LIU's TV Writers Studio, Bill Rabkin, moderate this discussion, as he's worked extensively in Asia. So just quick introductions. Bill Rabkin, prolific writer. He and his partner Lee Goldberg were showrunners for Diagnosis Murder and Martial Law. And Bill's written on his own for shows like Monk, Psych, and The Glade. And in the past few years, he has created and written HBO Asia's first sci-fi series. I should add, by the way, that Sneha Kurs, who's a wonderful writer and a friend who had written on Daredevil, The Umbrella Academy, and The Witcher, unfortunately, very sadly, her dog is in final throes of passing away, and so she cannot be with us today. So my regrets on behalf of Sneha. But I'm very, very grateful that our other two friends are here with us. Mauricio Katz, who I'm very grateful that you're with us, Mauricio. He has written for The Bridge, Maniac, created and is executive producer of the new series 000, and that's just in America. He's also written extensively in Mexico and all over the world. And I'm so happy to welcome Liz Keyishian Wilks, who is a fantastic writer and teacher and has written everything from hour-long dramas to half-hour animated shows such as Sophia the First, Astroblast, and she's also the executive producer of the upcoming Izzy B's Koala World, shot in Australia. So she's been back and forth to Australia for many reasons, over the years, she's been back and forth to Australia. So we have people who've worked in various continents with us, and I'm very interested to hear thoughts about the future of television, because I think we're going to be spanning continents more and more in the coming years. So Bill, maybe I'll turn it over to you, and maybe you can tell the story of your own experience working in China.
Okay, I do have to correct you first.
I always get it wrong.
I know. It's just that those three credits you mentioned, Monk, Psych, and The Glades, were done with Lee Goldberg. So due respect to him. Yes, I wrote a show called Dream Raider. I was hired by a first-time Chinese producer. Actually, it was producer Freeman and a writer called herself Scarlett decided they both worked in the lower levels of international co-productions and they want to move up to be creators. So they started putting the show together and then ran into a brick wall because they didn't really know what they were doing. Scarlett was taking this online TV writing class I teach at Screenwriters University. And I got an email from her saying, "Hi, my name's Scarlett. You don't know me. I don't have time to do my homework this week, but how would you feel about coming to Beijing for 2 weeks and consulting on this series?" Which, sounded sort of dodgy, but the next day I had half my fee and a plane ticket. So a round trip plane ticket, always be sure of that. I went there and started to consult. They had put together a writer's room, which was an interesting experience, described in a moment. As months of consultation and many trips to Beijing went on, Scarlett, the original writer, dropped out, and Freeman, the producer, asked me to take over as head writer. So I wrote 3 episodes. Because it's Hollywood, I got fired. I mean, it's Beijing, but it's Hollywood. And then 2 years later, I got a call saying they had set it up with HBO Asia, and HBO Asia hated everything that had been done since I left. Will I come back and take over again? So I did. So we shot last year 8 episodes. It will air someday, I am assured, since it was their most expensive series ever. I know it will, but they were finishing up post when the virus hit and all the post houses in China got shut down. So I don't know what the status is right now. But the room itself was fascinating because they knew what a room was supposed to be. They had read descriptions of a room. So they put people together in a room and said, here, create the series with no one who had any experience running a room or creating a series. And they were all lovely people and very talented, and nobody had the slightest idea what they were doing. That's why I went in there and sort of tried to train them how to maintain a writer's room and how to run a writer's room. And eventually they all drifted off in different directions.
And Maurizio, can you please tell us, share with us your experiences of working across continents, maybe the 000 experience? Would that be pertinent to all of this?
Yes, I mean, I think it's extremely pertinent because it's truly an international show. I mean, since I'm from Mexico, and even though I've been living in Los Angeles for a long time, the fact that I'm not an American writer has really opened up a lot of opportunities for me, not only in the United States, but outside of the United States. And I wrote a film called Miss Bala, and this is kind of what got me, broke me into Hollywood, and it's also what got me the gig at 000. Initially, they wanted, they always saw the show as an international show, and one of the storylines happened in Mexico, and I was working with the same team that had done Gomorrah, but I got introduced to those producers because of another writer friend named Peter Blake, whom because it's how we connected. So in a certain sense, because of the work I did in Mexico, but because I was working in LA, I got the opportunity to go work in Italy. And it was a really interesting experience because it wasn't just it was an Italian production or an Italian production company, but a French production because Canal Plus and Sky Atlantic were from the beginning. And in the interim, the Italian production company got bought by a British entertainment company. And we shot the series in in 3 continents, in 6 different countries. It's in 5 languages. It was an extremely the writers. It was only me and an Italian writer who's Leonardo Fasoli, who has written the Gomorrah series. His wife, who's also a writer, and an American writer named Max Horowitz. But we went to, even writing the series, it was a deeply international experience in the sense that we did very deep research. So we spent some time here in Mexico City, in Monterrey. We spent some time on a container ship. We went to Senegal, we went to Mali, we went to Morocco, we went to Calabria. We had consultants from all over the world. We had UN consultants, French consultants. We had notes from French people, notes from Italian people, notes from British people, notes from American people. So in every sense, this series was an international series, and when you see it, though, we shot in all these places, it's spoken in all these languages, and it was interesting because not only have I've had the opportunity, obviously, to work here in Mexico, and in Hollywood in writers' room, but also kind of see how they work in Europe, how they work in France, how they work in Italy. Yeah, and how kind of like the American writers' room and the American method of writing is really informing the rest of the world. Even though you have writers from everywhere, the model is the the American writers' room, without a doubt.
Interesting. So much more so than you feel like the American writers' room model has won out over the, shall we call it, British or French model of more of a single writer writing an entire 10 episodes of a series.
I mean, I think we live in very interesting times, and it is, and there are, well, you know, there's no one way to do it, and there are, you know, there are many series being written by one author, et cetera, et cetera. But what's interesting about these international shows, and not just the international shows, I think it's also happening in the writers' room in Hollywood, of what I've seen as far as diversity is coming. You know, diversity is not only coming as far as background and language, etc. You know, you see more and more a thirst for different points of views and people from all over the world. But I think, you know, that the American method of the writers' room is a very good method, and you know, obviously, you can see it in the output of American television. It's for a reason, I think.
And Liz and Bill, I feel I sort of like I will then back off, maybe, but
no, but I'm thrilled to have you there asking questions. But I do want to just jump in and actually sort of reframe what you were saying about the two systems. The system where one writer writes everything is still sort of universal in short forms, and will always be one style of doing it. But the two competing forms are really the showrunner system, which is the American system, and the old British system, which is a sort of a story editor system, where there is an executive at the network or studio who is hiring writers to write episodes. Not so much in the, you know, the Jimmy McGoverns of the world who write their own shows, but in the ongoing shows that are less auteur driven. That's been the status quo in a lot of cultures, certainly a lot of Asian cultures. And everybody knows they have to move to a showrunner system because the countries that are getting their shows onto Netflix, which is now the great driving thing, are shows run by a showrunner where there's a single defining point of view. And all these other cultures are going, wait, we want that too. Why can't we have it? But there are a couple of big hurdles in the way of making that shift every time. One is they don't have writers who are trained to be showrunners, and it takes a lot of time and money to train them. And the other is that the people who now have all the power, the studios, the networks, would inevitably have to give up some of their power to turn it over to a showrunner. And as you, a student of history, knows, I don't think there's ever been anyone ever in the world, except maybe for George Washington, who voluntarily gave up power.
Thank you. That's well said. So Liz, I want to include you in your Australian experience. Liz has gone back and forth from America to Australia, worked in both countries, and most recently did a show that was shot in Australia. And talk about getting enwrapped in international crisis, right? It's all about, well, they'll tell us about your show and what happened in Australia during the whole filming of it and all that.
Okay. Well, I'm primarily a kids animation writer. That's my thing. And I'm doing something at Sesame Workshop now, which is also animation. This show that I got luckily pulled onto is a doc reality show. And so it's Izzy's Koala World. And because, I mean, and I still am so grateful to have had the experience because, well, only a few people on this panel know this, but I'm married to an Australian. How I got the job in that I became an Australian citizen, and that's why I was working in Australia before. But when this job came up, it was the most unique job just for me because it was a kids show, but it was set in Australia. It had to do with koalas. They needed somebody who was willing to pick up and go to Australia for 6 weeks, who had had experience working with Australians and who loved animals. So it's pretty much me. I don't know who else would have been a better person for this job than me. And that, I can't think of a more unique moment, you know. But the hilarious part was also I got to go to Australia, to Magnetic Island, which is a tiny little island off the coast of Queensland, leaving my husband, the Australian, in LA, much to his chagrin, with running the ship here. So that was funny. But it was my first experience doing. It was an American crew coming into a very Australian place. It was soft scripted, which I've done docs before, but I'd never done a soft scripted show. So, and it's all about a 12-year-old girl who rescues koalas and runs an animal hospital with her mother, who is a veterinarian. And they had all these koalas that they were rescuing. In the middle of this, of course, towards the end of the shoot, the fires broke out in Australia, changing the tenor of the show. But at the same time, it's a kids show and it's for Netflix. So it was a very interesting moment that, you know, how to handle real life in the middle of a show that was kind of a fantasy about what if you had a house and baby koalas in your bed? Wouldn't that be fun? Which was really well, look at this kid who gets to play with koalas and she sleeps with them and now there's a major wildfire burning across your continent, and it became a slightly different show.
Mm. So. Bill, if you don't mind intruding on your panel yet again, there have been a couple of questions came in on the chat that I think just come to me as opposed to you being able to see them. One is actually from a showrunner and panelist from our first panel, Holly Sorensen. And Holly, you feel free to come online and open up your video and your audio. But she said, "Hi, Holly here. I'm starting my first international room next year. Tips for the American showrunner in assembling this room." So maybe Mauricio, you've assembled an international room. Any tips for an American doing this?
Well, I think it's a very specific question as to if she means that she's assembling a room in the United States or somewhere else. I definitely think that, you know, I can only kind of speak to my experience, and, you know, after 00, I had to assemble a room of the series I'm working on now, which is an adaptation of a very very great Latin American book called The Savage Detectives by Roberto Bolaño. And this is a series that's going to be in many languages, mostly in Spanish, but that is produced by HBO in the United States, kind of like what they did with My Brilliant Friend. And in this case, you know, as we did, initially the idea was to do the writer's room in Los Angeles and kind of like bring maybe writers from Mexico and have maybe some American writers and et cetera, which was, you know, a very appealing idea, and it's kind of how HBO had thought about it from the beginning. But ultimately, we you know, and we bounced around that idea to do it in Los Angeles for a long time. But ultimately, we decided to, you know, and because we were able to, and HBO was very supportive, to do the writer's room in Mexico City, since a lot of the action takes place in Mexico City, with mostly Mexican writers, but there were also some writers from different parts of the world. And this kind of brought us to a place where we could really, you know, I mean, in this particular case, we were writing, the writer's room was in the same street that is a very important street in the novel, for example. But, you know, one of the experiences that we had with 000 and the kind of like the investigation we could go do was to really be able to know the smell, you know, what it smells like in Senegal, what the streets look like, you know, to actually go to the place and be there and feel it. Holly is saying here that the room is international in the US. You know, I would definitely
I think she's
say
saying
that.
that she's going to be based in America, but the room is international. So she's, Holly, if I read you right, what we're saying is that she's the showrunner, she's here in LA, but then she's working with writers internationally. So it's that situation of a virtual room that's spread out across continents, I think.
Oh, yeah, no, I understand. Well, I mean, I have no tips for that specifically, but that sounds awesome. That sounds really incredible and diverse. And again, to be able to have like such, you know, a writer's room with, you know, writers from all over the world that are bringing different points of views from it is, you know, it sounds exciting, and it sounds like something unique, and it sounds something that can only happen kind of like in the, not just because of the COVID, but kind of like in the world we're living in, where, you know, it's these experiences of having international writers rooms are really opening up. And, you know, I find that, again, talking about diversity, that having all these different voices and all these different points of views, and, you know, especially international point of views, is something that is just beginning to happen. And I think we will see some very interesting TV shows with different sensibilities coming out because of this. So, you know, what advice I would offer: get the best writers from every single country that you're getting writers from. You know?
Always good advice, I think.
Yeah.
While we're on just a couple of questions, then Bill, I am going to just let you run with this. Adrian Mansamani asked, what challenges do Latino Asian writers face in the industry? And Mauricio, I think since you've had the experience of moving from Mexico, working in Los Angeles at very high levels, what were some of the challenges you felt like you faced when you came here?
Honestly, I have to say that I can't really speak to any challenges that I thought. I mean, that's not true. But I would like to say that more than feeling that I had any challenges because of being from Mexico, I felt that it was always a plus for me. I think that it is something that has always helped me. You know, in for example, the context of The Bridge, you know, I was the only Mexican writer in the room in the second season, and this obviously gave me a lot of clout in that room, and I feel that, you know, being from Mexico has opened up a lot of doors for me in Los Angeles and in the industry, because it has really given there's because I bring a different point of view, and because kind of the experience I have. For me, the challenges or what kind of I face the most, which, you know, I thank very much being able to work on a series of Maniac, is that, you know, sometimes I don't want to do things that are just social things, or you know, I get very pigeonholed into drug shows and drug things and et cetera, because I'm from Mexico and because of kind of like the background of shows that I've done. So, you know, I think the biggest challenge is sometimes to get pigeonholed in things that can feel a little constricting creatively. I have said no to many to good opportunities of shows that, you know, like I can only do one, you know, which was 000. That was a show that took 5 years to make, from the time we started writing it to the time it came out. And, you know, in the interim, I was offered a lot of different shows that were you know, border shows, or shows that had to do with crime or with drugs, et cetera, and I said no to many of them, you know, to shows that got made, that are big shows, et cetera, and, you know, I was able to other shows on Netflix about drugs and all this stuff, and, you know, in the end I could only do so much, and I didn't only want to so much about kind of what I'm pigeonholed into. And being able to do a show, for example, like Maniac, was a great opportunity for me, and it it allowed me to do something that's that has nothing to do with me being from Mexico. That just has to do more with talents and interests and stuff that I have. So, I would say that it's sometimes the challenge can be that sometimes it's a double-edged sword, because it pigeonholes you, I think, sometimes, but also being pigeonholed like that offers a lot of opportunities at the same time. So I think it's a balance between both.
Nice. Bill, one last question from our audience, and then you might be able to speak to this from your own experiences very accurately. This is from Aaron Mapleback. How do you believe different countries' communication methods, culture, and their format of cultural storytelling affect the writer's room?
Well, first of all, I will only answer this on the condition that you guarantee to stick around through the rest of this and continue to moderate, because you're doing a far better job than I could. I feel a little bit like a fraud trying to weigh in on this question. On both the shows I wrote for Chinese companies, I was the writer's room. On Dream Raider, there was an attempt to build that writer's room, but it ended up me trying to teach people who didn't speak English how to write television American style. The next show I did there, it was 12 episodes, and it was all me. So what surprises me is how few cultural bumps there have been in writing for these Asian cultures and for the European countries I've been writing as well, particularly the Netherlands right now. I'm always worried writing in China that I am violating some, cultural precept, or that our storytelling is fundamentally different from their storytelling. And it's never come across that. Across the way. The only cultural correction I ever got was from a Chinese producer who got mad because I had a character like saving people because he was simply a good guy and believed that was the right thing to do. And he said, no, in China, we'd never do that. Like, China, it's your family, it's your friends, and the rest of the world can go to hell. But, my other show there was an elaborate con man show, and they specifically came to me because they thought they didn't have anyone in China who knew how to plot like that. So it was all me. So I would urge you to ask Mauricio, or if Liz had a room in Australia, ask Liz.
Liz, I am curious, because I think most Americans figure America, Australia, not really that different. Do you run into any sort of cultural differences in your work in Australia?
It's interesting. It's more of a style than it is a cultural difference, but there's a much more, they're more relaxed generally. They like to take breaks. They like to chill. They like to laugh. On this Izzy Koala rule, we came in with our American style of, we're going to do this, we're going to get this done. We're working with a kid also, so there are certain rules that needed to be in place about how much the kid could work. So it was more of us learning to embrace, and it was also on an island. The island pace is very different from New York or LA. But I can't say that. That particular show was not an Australian staff. Australian work. But when I did animation rooms there, they were very similar, and it's not that dissimilar a culture. So I can't say, oh, it's all that different. There's an attitude in Australia about Americans that we are, super hot and cool, and everything we do is the best, and I did my best to undermine that attitude, because I'm a fan Australians and their humor, and I do think that Australian humor is a little wilder and brighter than American, and more probably surreal in its style. And I went in that direction. You know, it's easy to do that in animation because that's what you want, is brighter, wilder, and more surreal. So that was easy. And there's a current Australian show, animated show called Bluey, that now on this show that I'm about to start with undisclosed people, but Sesame Workshop is one of them. We are using that as one of our prototype shows because it's about kids, it's about dads, and it's about being at home. Actually, it's about all the fun you can have when you're at home with your parents. So it's very relevant to this moment. And they're very good at that. They're just, they embrace life in a different way than Americans tend to. And I'm speaking in a huge wash of generalization, but anyway, that was my experience.
And Mauricio, what about you? What's your take on all that?
I think for me it was and I can say this also working here in Mexico, etc. But for me, I think the biggest differences in like cultural differences were felt in the note giving, in taking notes from executives. I can tell you that it's very different getting notes from, you know, an American executive from HBO or FX to getting notes from a French executive at the, you know, at a network there, or by an Italian executive. You know, it's and those are truly cultural differences. It's not that I'm not claiming that somebody does it better than somebody else, et cetera, you know. And you know, I think Hollywood has a certain type of culture in dealing with the executives and in giving notes and in the way it's done. And you know, I don't want this to come off the wrong way or anything, because again, I know it's a cultural thing, but you know, there's a politeness in the American way of doing things, and there's a way of saying, you know, we love the work, we're huge fans, you know, like this is fantastic. There's always in, you know, this way in Hollywood of speaking that way. And then, you know, maybe in the French way of giving notes initially for me felt a little, you know, I was a little insulted at the beginning. I was like, it's like, you know, you don't have to say it like that. It's not like that. Oh. I understand if you don't like something, etc. But it was something that was purely a cultural thing. It was something that, you know, and even more coming from Mexico, where people are extremely polite and extremely, you know, careful not to offend anybody or something like that. You know, the French way is much more, I guess, direct, or you know, so initially it was hard for me to take notes and divorce myself from any criticism and realize that it was just a cultural thing, and I had to like listen to it beyond that, etc., etc. So I, you know, I think kind of like in my experience, it's kind of you know, criticisms are sometimes always maybe harder. Notes can be sometimes hard, etc. And that's where the cultural thing felt the heaviest. You know, and in 000, it wasn't just in the writing. You know, we had there's an Italian director, a Danish director, an Argentinian director, etc. So you know, it was all kind of like finding those ways of expressing, of being maybe a little blunt, that can be a little difficult sometimes, but it's just a cultural thing. No one's trying to be mean to you or anything like that.
I will say I had sort of exactly the opposite experience, especially in Asia. Once I started getting notes, I began to realize just how much of a hidden language there is in note giving in America. I mean, if you've been in the business in America, you know what they really mean when they say things. And again, they like to be polite in America. So they'll say, this is a really good first draft. And you know that means, oh my God, I have so much work left to do. And they'll say, thanks for getting it in so fast. And that means we are cutting you off and bringing in the next writer. It's all in code. And the odds are that in China and in Taiwan and everywhere else, they have their own code. But, I had no idea. I would get these pages of notes from China, particularly on the first show. It was okay because the producer was fluent in English, had gone to school in Australia. We became good friends, and it was easy to talk to him. But the second show was for a pretty good sized production company owned by a Chinese movie star, and he had a big development department. They always had one person who spoke English, inevitably somebody who'd gotten a degree at BAFTA, and she'd be in charge of sending me all their notes. And they're always sort of flowery and incredibly polite. I had no way of understanding what they really meant. We really love this, right? If somebody says in an American studio, we really love this, but it means, okay, Act 3 is out. Here, I didn't know if they really meant we really love this, or we meant we hate everything from start to finish. And I spent 2 years just never knowing where I stood on this project.
So you would have actually appreciated the French. It sounds like the French don't use that compliment sandwich technique. They just give you the meat of the criticism right away.
Well, as my students will attest, that's kind of like the way I like notes anyway. So it's just get to the point and let's all go home.
Here's a question from Cassidy LaPierre, and it's very pragmatic, but I am curious. Though Zoom and other similar platforms help connect people around the world, how do you balance the issue of time zones when your window to work at the same time is slimmed? So Mauricio, it sounds like maybe you in particular, because you were shooting and you were writing, and 000 was truly all over the map. Did you have time zone issues where there would be different? You were in one time zone and the French film executive was in another.
Yeah. I mean, that really only happened while shooting. In places that I couldn't be, and sometimes I would get messages very late or very early, and kind of like, oh, and I couldn't really calculate, or it was moving so fast that I can see it's like, oh, we need a rewrite for the scene. I'll be like, oh, okay, like I'll have my coffee, do my thing, whatever. It's like, no, we're about to shoot this thing because it's 9 o'clock and we're finishing the day, and for me it was in the morning, etc. But the actual writing was mostly done always either me being in Italy, or the writers being in Los Angeles, and there were in production it was a little more complicated, and you had to be more vigilant of receiving any request to rewrite a scene in any moment where it's a completely different time for me. But it was challenging, but I think you have to find a solution.
Liz, yes.
Me. I think that it can work to your advantage also, if because it's like having fairies or genies working overnight. If you give somebody an assignment and the next morning, like I wake up and if I was working with a British writer and an Australian writer, and it's like, oh, that it's like you get a complete the night. You go to bed at 10, and it's 17 hours later in Australia, so you have what you were looking for when you wake up in the morning. So it can, and especially with this, this possibility of us being in this virtual universe for the next year, it's going to be kind of interesting. And from my perspective, when I think of, what writers could I tap? I could tap writers from anywhere, because this is the way we're meeting. And I think that that's a very, I know that doesn't really answer your time zone question, but I think it's actually a pretty cool opportunity that we didn't have, that I didn't think we had before.
Yeah, it does seem as though the coronavirus, in a strange way, may open up through the world of virtual show running and virtual show creation international opportunities. I would like to close. We're actually coming down to the close of our time, but there was a very interesting question from one of the LIU students, Charisse, who said, how does pitching an international show to Americans differ from pitching an American series? So in other words, you're interested in pitching a show that's an international show like 000. How does that differ from pitching so you're pitching it to American executives? What's your experience in the difference in pitching a show that's basically set in America, an American series? Anyone?
So, I mean, I think, you know, I think that it's also very specific to each show. You know, I think, you know, in the case of 000, it was a show that had already been kind of like financed and bought by the European side, and it was a very different process of pitching to Amazon, because we had already written most of the series. There was already a big part of the budget in place, and we were looking for a buyer. So even in Amazon and in Netflix, there are different there are different departments. The original series that Netflix or Amazon are going to produce, hold, you know, they're going to put all the money. And, you know, if it's a Mexican series or an Italian series or etc., you have to go to a specific executive at these streaming, at these platforms that handle those countries, and etc. And in the United States, you have to go to the one that does the originals, etc. And then there's another department which does co-productions. So if you have an international series, for example, that you already have some interest by a network or a production company somewhere else, then you can kind of pitch everything. So you have more options of who to pitch to, I guess, because you can pitch to the original ones, you can pitch to the co-production ones, etc. In the case of the Savage Detectives, a series that I'm doing now, you know, it was, and again, I say this because I think every case is different. It's a Spanish language series. It's a very famous and beloved book in Spanish. And we went to pitch to every single local language Spanish platform, and everyone turned us down. Everybody said, this is too highbrow. You know, this is not what we're looking for, etc. And it was very disconcerting. And we kind of thought that was the end of it. And eventually, I went directly to HBO, to the executive of drama there, who I knew over the years, and I said, like, listen, I know you're doing international things. I know that things are opening up. I know you did My Brilliant Friend. There's this. We have the rights to this book. There's this pilot that's been written. Would you be interested in reading this and doing this project? And to my surprise, HBO said yes. And you know, and the pitching was a completely kind of like different thing, because it was, you know, like, it was pitched from, this is going to be an international show, this is based on this novel, etc. Initially there was a lot of like, you know, yes, but could you do it in English? And we're like, no, but you know, we want to do it in Spanish. And you know, there's all these like, but where are you going to shoot? It's dangerous in Mexico. You know, there were like all these questions that maybe made it questions that you wouldn't have if you were pitching just a show that was in the United States. And also, of course, there's the budget, because, you know, shooting in Mexico and in Spain and places where we're going to shoot for the show is cheaper. So there are, I think it is different, and there are a lot of considerations, and there are a lot of different avenues you can go to. You know, I think that the most interesting thing about the international shows right now is that you don't need the one network. You don't need just to go pitch to Netflix and to the originals, and you can kind of like get somebody interested somewhere that's willing to, or some network in the country where you're originating from, and then you can go and sell different bits and pieces. In the end, 000 is a co-production between Sky, between Canal Plus and Amazon, but it's being streamed in the Nordic countries in Europe in HBO, and it's being streamed it's being broadcast in different things. So I think an international show has those advantages. You don't need just the one okay from one executive at one streaming or at 3 streamers, or et cetera. You can kind of like originate the project with a little bit of the budget, a little bit of the thing, and then make it grow from there and sell it bits and pieces. So I think it has that advantage, and it makes it very different, because you don't have to pitch it like, oh, I have this idea that I want you to buy it. It'd be like, I already have all this behind me, or this is something that will appeal to different countries. This is I feel there's different opportunities as far as to whom you pitch.
Wonderful. Well, on that very optimistic note, which I think is great, it speaks to the exciting future of international shows, international co-productions. I want to say thank you so much to Mauricio and Bill. Elizabeth, Liz is hanging out with us as we continue on into our mini room and tools of the future trade discussion. So thank you so much, Mauricio, and thank you, Bill, for being with us. It was really fantastic.